After a sound sleep, we awoke to the serene tropical paradise of English Harbour on the Caribbean island of Antigua. Having arrived in the night and anchoring rather close to the vessel in front, we had promised to move Poco Andante in the morning. Moving was straightforward, although it did take 4 attempts to re-anchor. The bottom was hard and the holding wasn't brilliant. Poco was finally anchored firmly and we prepared to enjoy the delights of this idyllic location. Keith and I spent the first 2 weeks recovering from the Atlantic crossing and carrying out repairs at anchor. English Harbour is an 18th century naval dockyard, famous as Admiral Lord Nelson's first shore-based command. Very picturesque with a white palm-fringed beach and warm turquoise blue water. The weather was changeable with lots of sun interspersed with showers and a nice cooling breeze. We slowly began joining in with the cruising community here. Rum punches went down very smoothly. They were mainly US and UK boats, all of whom were very companionable. Sundowners in company became a way of life. Poco's sails had taken a bit of a battering and the watermaker had packed up during the crossing, so these were priority items, plus a myriad of small items that needed attending to. Antigua had a very efficient system regarding repairs, etc. Everyone listened to and communicated on the VHF radio. You could call on channel 68 and change to another channel to discuss requirements, etc. Many of the businesses monitored the VHF as well as the phone. VHF is easy and free. Events, weather, parties, happening, etc. were all announced on the VHF. And you could also check who else was in harbour. Refrigeration for cold beers and wine was becoming a constant problem for us. The engine-driven fridge compressor that was chewing up drive belts since we'd replaced the engine, and we were relying on the 110-volt compressor, which was extremely power-hungry. Most people spent their time at anchor, so conservation of power and water is a major concern. Our watermaker had failed on the Atlantic crossing, and the local expert diagnosed a cracked membrane. A replacement was ordered. Poco Andante had capacity for 600 litres in the main tank, plus another 100 litres in jerry cans, so we didn't actually run out of water and we had enough for regular showers. In a harbour or marina, you could usually purchase water if need be, or you can collect rainwater. Once the watermaker problem was solved, we would be self-sufficient in water again. When we first arrived, we had anchored next to a catamaran from Hamble called Milliways. Heather and David had designed her for world cruising. They had been there for 2 or 3 months already after their Atlantic crossing and were repairing their fuel tanks and waiting for some bits to be flown out from the UK. One evening, they introduced us to the joys of the Antigua and Barbuda Royal Navy Yacht Club. The Yacht Club is a philanthropic club that carries out social activities and good works in and around English Harbour. Charitable giving for schools and local groups, clearing paths and maintaining monuments, etc. The members meet every night at 6 p.m. and continue the Royal Navy tradition of toasting the Queen with a tot of rum. Most of the members are yachties and live off-island, as it's called, with a sizable following of expats and ex-Navy folk. Sundays are keep fit days and involve a bit of work. For the 2 Sundays that we were there, Keith helped paint a monument to the Devon and Dorset Regiment that was stationed there in the 18th century. A new problem we encountered was marine growth on the bottom of the well-used dinghy. Keith was busy one day scrubbing this on the beach when Mike from Altair turned up to complete the same task. His solution was to turn the offending dinghy over and cover it with a medium bleach solution. Intrigued with his suggestion, Keith followed suit. The next stage was to visit the nearest bar for a cold beer. They then returned to the beach and washed off the now dead growth. Job done. Mike and Jill from Altair were completing a Caribbean circuit before returning to the UK. We shared the same home port and have been thankful for their advice ever since. Above our anchorage off Gullion Beach is a place called Shirley Heights. This was named after one of my ancestors, Shirley being my family name. Most Sunday nights they have a steel band, barbecues, etc. The views are tremendous overlooking the island, especially as the sun goes down. We drank in the view and toasted my forebears, thanking them for such a good discovery. It was great to talk to the more experienced cruisers and get their advice and recommendations. One major decision was where to spend the following hurricane season. The insurance companies and common sense dictate that the yachts are moved out of the hurricanes region between 10 and 23 degrees north or south of the equator during June to November. Most cruisers were heading to either Trinidad or Venezuela, both within 10 degrees of the equator. One American yacht suggested cruising the east coast of the USA. This really tickled my fancy. I realised that having no fixed plan opened up more possibilities. We contacted the US consulate in Antigua on VHF radio, and the consul inquired where Poco was anchored. It turned out she walked her dog at Galleon Beach every day, so we arranged to meet at the beach bar for more information. This could only happen in Antigua. It transpired that we would need a 10-year multi-entry visa. These could be issued in Barbados. Very helpfully, she advised us how to make an appointment, what paperwork would be required, and had all the information about flights from Antigua to Barbados. But these would have cost at least $500 each. We decided to sail down 250 miles against the prevailing winds. No problem. I made an appointment online for the next week, beginning of March, to allow plenty of time to get there. The first 24 hours of the trip to Barbados were pretty grim. Wind on the nose, lumpy seas and driving rain. We ended up motoring much of the time. Eventually conditions became calmer and we ended up having an easy sail. In Barbados, the customs and immigration mainly accommodate cruise ships, and they insisted that yachts tie up at the cruise ship terminal and clear in. We came alongside this huge harbour wall with only the top of Poco's mast sticking up above it. Luckily, a passenger from one of the cruise ships offered to catch a line and tied us up. Keith then clambered up the harbour wall and made us secure. Our rigging was dangerously close to the mooring warps from one of the cruise ships, so I opted to stay on board in case any problems ensued. Clearing in took around an hour, and we were then allowed to move around to Carlisle Bay, a lovely bay with clear turquoise water, white sandy beaches and beach bars for the cruise ship passengers to enjoy. There were even 4 or 5 brand new moorings available, and the resort actually asked us to pick one up, partly to protect the environment, but also because the yachts make a really lovely backdrop for the holiday makers' photos. We had a great time in Barbados. The people were incredibly friendly and happy. We spent 5 days enjoying the local facilities. We took our books onto the beach and lazed on the lounges, swam, read and snorkeled. There were 2 sunken wrecks just off the beach, teeming with fish, etc. I even saw a turtle grazing on the seagrass. Whilst waiting for our US Embassy appointment, we toured the Mount Gay rum distillery and strolled around Bridgetown. One morning, while washing the dishes, I glanced out the window and saw a boat moving past quite close. I made a comment to Keith and didn't think much more about it, until a few minutes later, when something else caught my eye. I suddenly realised that it wasn't the other boat that was moving, it was us. By then, Poco Andante was about half a mile out to sea. Meanwhile, I hastily started the engine. Keith let go of the mooring and we went back in and anchored. We still have no idea why the mooring moved. We'd been sitting happily on it for 5 days and conditions were benign. Keith reported the incident to the resort so they could recover their mooring, and we learned not to trust moorings he didn't know. After this incident, if we picked up a mooring that we didn't know about, Keith usually snorkeled to check its condition and whether it looked strong enough to take our 19-ton. We were finding that life in the Caribbean suited us. It was a great relief to realise that, at last, Poco Andante was our home and all the boat systems worked together, enabling us to live the perfect lifestyle. When sailing, the wind was free and anchoring was free. The 2 wind generators and 2 solar panels were producing enough power to run the boat systems, and the water maker was keeping up with demand. At last, we were living well within budget. The day of our appointment at the US Embassy finally arrived, and we joined about 20 or 30 locals in the queue. We presented our papers and had a very brief interview. The staff were very efficient and polite, and by noon we had our 10-year multi-entry US visas. We now needed to head north to use them. The next day we set sail for Fort de France in Martinique, about 110 miles away. We got stuck there for 3 days waiting for good weather, but enjoyed ourselves nonetheless. Eventually the weather improved and we went ashore to clear out. It was approaching lunchtime and the officer in charge was not even interested. In fact, he basically sent us on our way empty-handed. We left in a brisk easterly breeze. Sailing in the Caribbean can be quite idyllic. Our sail from Martinique back to Antigua was no exception. 2 days of 15 to 20 knots in the lee of the islands and 20 to 25 knots in the open passes. We saw our first whale, which was a surprise. After 2 days' rest in Antigua, we sailed overnight to St. Martin. As we approached the island, we had a call from a yacht called Pipe Dream. They had lost their engine and had no charts or pilot book on board, and they were on their way to St. Martin to make repairs. Acting as pilot, we helped this unfortunate guy into the anchorage. Little did we know that the next year we would be in the similar situation off St. Martin. St. Martin is an island about 7 miles square. One half belongs to France and the other to the Netherlands Antilles. It's Holland. There are 3 currencies. The French side is just like a small French town, good food, cheap wine and uses euros. The Dutch side uses guilders or US dollars and has all the chandleries. The whole island is duty-free, communications are good, and their main industry is yachting. Prices are very competitive and nearly everything is available. The island is separated by a huge lagoon. Everyone zooms around in ribs, and it was great fun to put the 15 horsepower outboard engine on ours and join in. To make navigation interesting, the French adopt the European voyage system with the red marks on the left, and the Dutch side uses the American system where the red marks are on the right. It is also a major harbour for super yachts with some wonderful boats to behold, both sail and power. Some had helicopters and one even had a Porsche on board. St. Martin is a stopping point for many cruisers to refit and just catch their breath. The cruiser community is strong, with a great VHF radio net on Channel 14. The news about barbecues, potluck dinners, boat jumbles, etc. With such good chandleries, we were able to get most of the bits we needed. There always seemed to be something that needed replacing. After all, Poco Andante was being used 24/7. St. Thomas in the American Virgin Islands would be our port of entry into the US. We were so accustomed to the friendly officials in most of the Caribbean islands that the brusque attitude of the US officials took me by surprise. We felt really unwelcome and, with mountains of paperwork required, started to rethink our decision to cruise the east coast of the US that summer. It may not be a good idea. However, they eventually allowed us to enter. Our anchorage was off the cruise terminals, and watching the cruise ships arrive, sometimes 4 at a time, was a spectacle. We also rediscovered the joys of US supermarkets with good and plentiful produce. Keith celebrated with a large American steak and chips, fries, while watching the floating pizza restaurant and floating bar tour the harbour. There was a price to pay for all that protein. The next day Keith was stricken with acute abdominal pain and became convinced he had appendicitis. With the cost of US healthcare, this would have been a bit of a nightmare. Would he be fit enough to survive a flight back to the UK? One of the books we had inherited with Poco Andante was Where There Is No Doctor, a fabulous book aimed mainly at our African cultures, but with very clear diagrams on how to perform a wide range of checks and procedures. Armed with the book in one hand and an empty drinking glass in the other, I approached the prone Keith. He looked rather alarmed, but the prodding, pressing and listening to his abdomen resulted in a diagnosis of wind. Keith was exceedingly sceptical, but nature ran its natural course, and after a few days he was well again. Amusingly, when we went back to the UK about 6 months later for his daughter's graduation, Keith insisted on getting the GP to check his abdomen. Luckily, he agreed with my diagnosis. We experienced our first fouled anchor in St. Thomas. A local yachtsman knocked on our hull to warn us that an Austrian boat had dragged its mooring overnight and was now very close to us. There was no one on board. The guy had been trying to raise the authorities with no joy. Luckily, the owners of the dragged boat returned and, with no comment or apology, slipped the mooring and headed off out of harbour, leaving a mess behind. Now free, the mooring swung back and ended up wrapped around our anchor chain. Luckily, our windlass was powerful enough to lift the mooring anchor, and a quick flip with our boat hook set us free. However, the sinker took our boat hook with us. After re-anchoring, Keith donned snorkel gear and managed to retrieve the said boat hook from the bottom of the harbour. We left for Culebra, an island off the US territory of Puerto Rico. We had been granted a 6-month provisional visa for the US in Thomas. We now needed a 12-month cruising permit for Poco Andante. For some unknown reason, they didn't issue them in St. Thomas. After the short hop from St. Thomas, we anchored in the protected harbour at Culebra. The customs man was based at the airport, and a short walk there was very refreshing. The officer was very friendly and helpful. He had organised his office with one wall displaying examples of the 7 completed forms required and laid out the blank ones below for you to complete. With cruising permits in hand, we went to the dinghy dock, the local haunt for cruisers, for happy hour, and met up with a group of Americans who gave us a lot of advice concerning our trip north. After a few days, we headed to Fajardo, about 24 nautical miles away on the mainland of Puerto Rico, to meet our first visitors since we left the UK. Pat and Paul flew into San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico, and took a taxi to Puerto del Rey Marina on the east coast. We'd checked into the marina, figuring it was easier for them to embark there, and for us to fill up with fuel and water for their holiday. We planned a trip around the Spanish Virgin Islands, with short day sails and lots of time in unspoiled, picturesque anchorages. Our first stop was Vieques, a small island about 25 miles southeast of Puerto Rico. This island had been used as a military base and firing range over the years and was only relinquished a year or so prior. At Ensenada Sun Bay, we anchored in a beautiful cove lined with white sandy beach fringed with palm trees. Poco Andante was the only boat there on the first night. Idyllic and picturesque, postcard pretty. One still evening, we took the river round to the next bay, Bahia de Mosquitos, which is famous for its bioluminescence. The phosphorescence is caused by thousands of one-celled microorganisms called dinoflagellates that glow when the waters are disturbed. It was stunning. Not only were there sparkles when the water was moved, but an overall glow like the underwater lighting as the propeller turned up the wake. Keith went in for a swim and his whole body glowed. As he climbed back on board, he briefly sparkled as the microorganisms were stuck into his body hair. Difficult to describe, but amazing to behold. Ashore, there was a small town, Esperanza, where I managed to buy bread. The shoreline was littered with the usual collection of beach bars and souvenir shops, and the local museum offered about 6 computer terminals for internet access. Really useful, and it was a great surprise in the middle of nowhere. The main means of transport were horses, and many of them grazed freely on the island. This area of the Caribbean is also the nesting ground for sea turtles. Many of these were spotted swimming along with signs of their nesting sites on the beach. Pat asked one of the dive companies in Esperanza where they took their daily expeditions, and they told her Isla de Shiva, a reef off the island. We sailed there and dropped anchor for a couple of hours while everyone went exploring. There were giant elk-horned corals, stingrays, moray eels, and some hungry-looking barracudas, which scared Pat and Paul. After lunch, we sailed east again to our next stop, Bahia Salinas del Sur, a deserted bay with a tricky entrance through a coral reef. The bay was used by the military as a bombing range, and the beach was littered with unexploded shells. There were signs all along the beach warning of unexploded ordnance. We swam from the boat and snorkeled off the reef. There was colourful fan coral, brain coral, and the usual small but colourful reef fish. We even came across an unexploded torpedo stuck in at 45 degrees, complete with tail fin and propeller. Scarier than sharks. After a night or two there, we set off for Culebrita, a small island about 10 miles northeast of Vieques. Our cruising guide said that there was a fantastic safe anchorage on the southwest corner of the island, but so small there was only room for about 2 boats. When we arrived, it was certainly fantastic, clear turquoise blue water, but there was already one yacht there. We carefully picked our way through the reef to the small anchorage hole. The other yacht gave up trying to get his anchor to hold, and after several failed attempts, we decided to follow suit. It was back out through the reef and across the 1-mile channel to the larger island of Culebra. Early next morning, before breakfast, we returned to Culebrita and were pleased to discover we were the first ones there and had the anchorage to ourselves. It was well worth it. The water was glorious, warm, clear, turquoise, and just like the postcards. Our tourist information mentioned a natural jacuzzi pool on the north end of the island, so we followed a path there. We came across a lovely lagoon with surf breaking across the reef entrance. On one side were the Atlantic seas crashed against these boulders about the size of a house, and on the other side a sheltered natural pool formed by the coral reef. We watched for a while and felt brave enough to go for it and scrambled into the pool. The water fizzed as the breaking waves filtered under the boulders and into the pool. The resultant effect was just like a jacuzzi. We lay there and enjoyed it in the sunshine and enjoyed 15 minutes of sheer relaxation. It came as a huge surprise. "Look out," I shouted, as a freak wave broke completely over the top of the huge boulders. It was later reported that yachts at sea had suffered knockdowns as a result of this monster wave. The wall of water flushed us all out of the pool and tumbled us across coral-covered rocks and into adjoining pools. Both Keith and I had grown up enjoying surf beaches, so we knew to stay low until the surge eased. I wedged my sandaled foot between two rocks, trying to stop myself being swept further. It felt like being in a rock-strewn washing machine, and I was gradually running out of breath. At last the swirling water eased a little, and I surfaced to grab a lungful of air before being swamped again as a second wave followed. Another trick learned as a child in the surf. The strength of the water eventually forced me to surrender my foothold, literally, and tumble into the next pool, losing my sandal in the process. Finally the water settled and I scrambled to my feet, anxiously looking around for the others. Keith was about 5 metres away and he looked okay, but I couldn't see any sign of Pat and Paul. I carefully clambered up the rocks, realising I had lost one of my sandals, and finally saw Pat sprawled across the rocks about 10 metres away. Paul had made it to the beach. It looked like carnage. There was blood flowing down their bodies, legs and arms. They answered when called and were obviously very shaken. We quickly reached them and I realised that they were in severe shock. Pat kept saying she thought she was going to die and Paul was just stunned and silent. A quick once-over revealed that most of the bleeding was coming from coral cuts, which didn't look too deep, except the back of Pat's hand. I could see a flap of skin about 3 centimetres wide hanging off the back of her hand near the wrist, and the bones and tendons and flesh were startlingly white. Not a pretty sight. Keith quickly whipped off his t-shirt and wrapped it around Pat's hand so she wouldn't see the mess. Paul's chest and thigh had big gashes. Keith and I exchanged private glances and wordlessly agreed that the wounds would need medical attention, but from where? While the adrenaline was still pumping, we gathered together those belongings which hadn't been swept away and frog marched them back towards the dinghy. I knew that we should use that adrenaline rush to get them back to the yacht before shock paralysed them. As we got them on board Poco Andante, the clouds were building and the sky darkening. While Keith started the engine and raised the anchor, I got them to take hot showers for warmth, then lie on top of clean sheets spread over the saloon berths and started cleaning their wounds, applying betadine and sterile dressings. I forced them to drink cups of hot sweet tea and put on warm clothes. Shock was well and truly settling in. Shivers and shakes, tears and misery. Once they were settled, I hastily pulled our electronic charts up on the computer and set a course back out through the reef across to Culebra using our previous track. Keith steered his way out into deeper water while I checked our cruising and travel guides for information about the nearest medical facility. According to our books, the nearest was way back on Puerto Rico mainland, about 6 hours away through coral country. The day was getting on and visibility was poor. Not a good combination. We had no mobile phone reception, so we couldn't ring the hospital on the mainland for information. All I could try was the VHF radio. I put out a pan-pan call. This is used instead of Mayday when there's actually no life at risk. There was no response at all. Again and again I made the call, trying to sound really calm so that our injured guests didn't panic. Finally the VHF burst into life. Heart of Texas, another cruising yacht, had heard my call and had a satellite phone. They advised that there was a hospital at Dewey, the main town on Culebra, and gave me the phone number. I explained that we had no phone reception. They kindly agreed to phone the hospital and advised them we were on our way. Now we had a destination, but the weather was closing in. A tropical storm was building. Keith motored at full speed. We worried about the channel into Culebra in the poor light, and, just as we approached the entrance, the heavens opened. Visibility was down to less than 20 metres. From the computer, I sent each course and distance to the GPS repeater in the cockpit. Keith steered by compass, relying on making eye contact with each buoy as we reached it. At last we got through the narrow entrance into the bay and headed the mile or so up to town. Keith and I discussed the options. We knew from our previous stay that the holding at the anchorage was good, but with the wind picking up we weren't too sure. We decided that Keith would have to stay with the yacht and I would take Pat and Paul to the hospital. I went below and helped them put on heavyweight wet weather gear. Keith and I were already wearing our lightweight oilies. Then I was back on the helm while Keith dropped the anchor. Getting Pat and Paul into the dinghy was a bit of an effort. They were both still very shaky on their feet. I steered the dinghy over to the dinghy dock, actually alongside the local bar, to be greeted with laughter and catcalls about our space invaders and the like. The tipsy clientele thought we were wimpy for wearing our bright yellow oilies. They were silenced when I asked the way to the hospital, to be told it was about 500 metres away at the top of the hill. Pat, Paul and I eventually limped exhausted into the cottage hospital, but it turned out we would have to wait. During the couple of hours it had taken us to get there, some poor guy had fallen off his motorbike in the stormy conditions and needed emergency treatment. Pat and Paul were only walking wounded. The young female Spanish doctor eventually called them in, and I explained in my broken Spanish what had happened. Pat's hand needed stitching, and so did Paul's thigh. Thankfully, my emergency first aid treatment got 5 stars from the doctor, which was really satisfying. Paul couldn't bear to watch Pat being stitched and asked me to stay with her, not that I particularly wanted to watch it either. I spent the time talking to Pat to take her mind off what the doctor was doing. I then had to do the same thing for Paul. I had taken the handheld VHF with me to try to call Keith, but there was so much interference due to the storm that I couldn't get through. It was several hours later that we carefully walked down the hill to the dinghy, only to discover that it had about 150 ml of rainwater inside. I bailed it out and finally got us all back on board the boat. Keith and I sent Pat and Paul to bed and dosed them up with antibiotics and sleeping tablets given to them by the doctor to help them sleep. At last we had a chance to talk about what had happened. Keith needed stitches to his shoulder and my ankle had a nasty gash. We used some adhesive sutures from the first aid kit and we were both scratched all over. By the time we finished cleaning ourselves up, we looked like yellow patchwork from the betadine. Still mildly shocked ourselves, with the adrenaline wearing off, we crawled into bed and slept. As a footnote, about a year later, we caught up with Heart of Texas and were able to thank them in person for their help. After a few days to recover from this harrowing experience, we sailed back to Fajardo on mainland Puerto Rico. We all agreed to hire a car and explore El Yunque, the only tropical rainforest in the US, followed by San Juan, the historic capital of Puerto Rico. The rainforest was spectacular, full of the sounds of tree frogs and birds, and with colourful flowers and green ferns and trees. We'd been told by many US people that Old San Juan was interesting, but we weren't too sure how it would compare with some of the wonderful cities in Europe. It wasn't disappointing. The narrow hilly streets are cobbled with blue bricks which were brought onto the island as ballast in the early sailing ships. The architecture is very Spanish, with balconies and courtyards. The old fortress was worth the tour, well preserved and with spectacular views over the city and the harbour. After a few more days, Pat and Paul flew to New York, and Keith and I stayed on to explore more of mainland Puerto Rico, including visiting the Bacardi factory, as a tribute to one of Keith's former employers. The tour was plastic compared with the tour of the Mount Gay distillery in Barbados, and it was very marketing oriented. Then it was off to the Arecibo Radio Telescope Observatory in the heart of Puerto Rico. The geology inland was fascinating. Lumpy hills called karst, limestone outbreaks with some huge underground caverns. The radio telescope was the largest in the world at that time, and it was fascinating. An amazing feat of engineering, with a 700-ton receiver suspended over the huge aluminium dish, and all aligned to within 0.1 millimetre. The visitor centre was informative and included a film A Day in the Life of, featuring the scientists, engineers, cleaners, cooks, maintenance staff, etc. We really enjoyed our visit there. Unfortunately, the telescope collapsed in 2020 following the failure of one of the cables. We spent a week at anchor off Fajardo, catching up on cleaning, laundry, etc., and ferrying 300 litres of water in jerry cans by rib to replenish our water tanks. A visit to town was an expensive experience. We bought lots of DVDs and invested in the new then wireless technology so we could access the internet from the growing number of hotspots around. With the hurricane season approaching, we decided to take the advice of several US cruisers who recommended going as far north as we could. The cruise back down the east coast of the USA would be slow, with both the winds and the current against us. The ocean voyage from Puerto Rico to Bermuda would take about 10 days, directly through the Bermuda Triangle, followed by about 6 days to Maine. Wind and sea conditions for the trip would probably be better later in April than earlier, so we returned to Culebra to make sure both Keith and I and the boat were ready for another ocean passage. By arriving in Maine in May, Poco Andante would have a full year to get back to the southern end of the Caribbean before the start of the next hurricane season. But that's the next chapter.